Welcome to Peninsula Seniors Lecture Series. Sit back, get comfortable, and let's go see what Marty has for us today.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome once more to another of the Peninsula Seniors Wednesday morning lecture program. We have a repeat speaker with us this morning who spoke to us about 3 or so months ago. And this individual is now in the hospitality industry, but prior to that, he was a Foreign Service officer with the State Department and is going to describe his two loves, I guess, Foreign Service and Trump National Golf Club, where he is the general manager and director of golf. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome Mr. David Conforti.
Thank you, Marty. Thank you very much. Working for the Trump organization can be a little fast-paced at times, so you'll get a very straight shot from me in that this was put together in reasonably short order. There is a lot of thought that went into it, and really a little bit of short order, but hopefully you enjoy what I have to show you. Who am I? How did I get here? It's very seldom I can come and speak in front of a great group of people and talk about myself, so hopefully that doesn't get too boring. But I am originally from Orange County, and I decided to kind of shuck all conventional colleges and went to a college called Virginia Military Institute. After that, as you know, I went to work for Department of State. We'll talk about that at length. And then I got into the PGA of America to pursue my passion, which is golf. Getting started out about me, if you will, as I like to say, this is obviously our hemisphere with North and South America. And then if you will go again, this is where my life has taken me thus far. Obviously, we're starting here. I went over here to Virginia Military Institute for college. From there, stayed in that general area and went to Washington, D.C. for a couple of years. The short version, which we'll get a lot more of in just a few minutes, went to Bolivia for a couple of years, up to Barbados for about a year and a half, New York City for a year, and then after leaving government service, I got into the world of golf, and that's where I really started to zigzag. The zigzagging going down to Tampa, California, Mexico, Bahamas, Virginia, Ohio, and then finally I ended up here about 2.5 years ago. So it's been a pretty interesting ride. It's been one that hasn't had me establish many roots, certainly, and I'll talk about that a little later too, but it's been a great trip so far. I don't know how many of us liked ourselves in high school without going into childhood psychology. I felt I needed a little bit of a kick in the butt, and I had no military aspirations whatsoever, so I thought, well, let me go to this school who purports to, make at the time we were men only, so we're going to make a man out of you, and we're going to give you some discipline and give you some honor and some integrity and all. So I thought, why not? It's far from home. I was ready to move away from home, leave the nest, if you will. So I was 17 years old, and I went to a school called Virginia Military Institute. And this is what I get for about a year. Hence the title, Mom, You Can Pick Me Up Now. It was... As you know, from any Academy graduates or any Citadel graduates, and of course Virginia Military Institute graduates, the first year is one of initiation and one of, getting beat up a lot. So it did a lot for my self-confidence. It sounds crazy, 20 years now, I still feel like I'm riding that wave of self-confidence. So, and that wave of self-confidence really culminated with this. Your first year at VMI is called your rat year. At the academies, you're called plebes. At Citadel, you're called knobs. We are called rats. So, to no longer be a rat, they pick the coldest winter day in Virginia history, and they water out a field with the fire truck in the background, which is originally dirt, and so now it's mud, and they make you climb through about 70 yards of 800 upperclassmen through the cold mud. Once you make it through there, you are officially a person again. So that's me right there. Somebody's obviously about to make fun of me. That's me after being in all that mud. So when I talk about having a little bit of self-confidence and riding that wave years later, they put you through a certain routine that a lot of folks don't get to experience. That makes all those folks smarter than me. You can see the trees back there without any leaves on. It was quite literally 34 degrees that day, and I'm a Southern Californian, so not a ton of fun there. So fast forwarding to graduation day, as you can see, our barracks kind of looks like a prison, as was told to me several times. Rest assured it's not, but this was my college experience. And it was very Spartan, and it was very military-like, and of course it got us ready for working for the government in some capacity. That's me clowning around with barracks in the background. One more, pretty please. There's my mom and dad, and going to the next one. Of course that's my dad's My dad's quote, of course, can't believe he graduated one more. Mom, later on, neither can I. So that's the kind of, that's the kind of support I got from home. Okay, so, note the hair there, no receding hairline. It's, guys, I know we're all in the same boat here. So anyway, so that was me back in military school. I was trying to figure out what to do with my life, and which is often the case now. But I really wanted to go in the Navy. And after a couple of years of being at VMI, I thought, wouldn't it be great to be surface warfare and be able to serve our country in that way? Well, I went to get a naval scholarship after my second year at VMI, and if you can think of every possible affliction that could happen to the human body, pinky toe to a follicle of hair, everything, there is one thing that at that time the Chief of Naval Operations would not let you ask for a waiver for, as an issue with your body goes. And I had it. It had to do with my eyes. So the writing was on the wall that I was not going to go into the Navy. I tried to plead my case and say I don't want to fly. I don't even need to drive your boats. I just want to work on board, and they wouldn't have me. So the government came calling, and I get this in the mail, and it caught me in the beginning of my junior year wondering, okay, well, what am I to do? I don't want to go home. I'd like to stay back here. I love Virginia, but I wouldn't mind working for Uncle Sam in some sort of clandestine capacity. It was really, you think some things are meant to be. I get a letter in the mail one day. It is from Department of Defense, and it's saying, why don't you apply with us? Now, I am forsworn from telling you all where I worked when I was with Uncle Sam. I worked for Department of State, but I will let you all put two and two together as we go through this presentation today, and you all can figure it out for yourselves. The process was simple. I called this 800 number and talked to somebody with a deep voice. I said, hey, I'm 19 years old. I want to work for Uncle Sam. Where do I sign up? So it started a 9-month-long process where the gentlemen in trench coats would come to VMI unannounced and interview those around me. I remember the story of my golf coach. I played golf in college on the golf team. He was out hitting practice balls, and he literally has two guys in trench coats and sunglasses walk up to him on the driving range and, are you Coach, or are you Reggie Webb? Yes, I am. And, and they say, well, do you know David Conforti? And, of course, his first thought is, oh, my God, what kind of trouble did he get himself into? So they did all their background checks on me, went to neighbors and whatnot. I then had to go through a series of psychological exams, and then take a polygraph, which is not common for many government organizations. So that helps narrow down as to where I really worked. And voila, they said, sure, we'll take you. So when I was considering, what to do and how to serve, you're going to find one of the themes throughout this presentation today is that perhaps some things are meant to be. And the organization that came a-calling, I wasn't even sure how to get a hold of them. Of course, back in the late 80s, there was no internet, and I didn't realize there was simply a phone number in the phone book for getting a hold of them. So they came to me. I was very fortunate, very blessed, if you will, and I started service with them in July of 1991 after I graduated. So the next bit was decide, well, where to go. They're terrific in that they say, well, you can pick one of 6 areas of operation in the world, broken down predominantly amongst continents: Europe, Latin America, Asia, East Asia, Africa, and that type of thing. So, obviously, given I was going to be working overseas, I would have had to learn a language. And I thought, well, I don't want to learn Uzbeki or Bangladeshian because that's going to let me serve in one place for 2 to 4 years. Then I have to come back and learn a language all over again. So I thought, why not go with Spanish? That way I can operate for an entire career without having to go back to school again. So I chose Latin America as an area of operations. Before I could do that, it took 2.5 years of training. And it's pretty exhaustive. I learned 6 weeks of admin. I learned 6 weeks of paramilitary, including jumping out of a plane. Learned weapons training and whatnot. So then we took 6 months of overseas training. It was pretty intense. It was done at an offsite. And they teach you everything from surveillance detection to how to ask somebody to work for you on behalf of your government, how to ask somebody to steal their secrets for you, and not get caught doing it. It was pretty intense. And one thing you would find about the espionage business is that in many respects it's less your ass on the line as it is theirs. What you're doing is you're finding somebody. You're finding some either flaws in their character or there's some weaknesses or some motivations on their part and seeing if you can't get them to do your dirty work for you. Now, this is certainly a roundabout way of serving. It's not me being on a front line. It's not me being in the Army or Navy or whatnot. but it is, the business of intelligence gathering. And it was, to this day, I feel it's very important. Now, we all have our opinions as to how the intelligence community does. Being part of it for several years, I would tell you that it's excruciatingly difficult. It's a lot of psychology. It's a lot of luck. It's a lot of people skills. And it's I got to go back to it again, it's a lot of luck. So 2.5 years of training later and 7 months of Spanish language training later, I say, okay, well, I would love to go to an Andean country. How about an Andean country? Let's try that. I didn't want to go to Mexico. No disrespect to Mexico. It's right here. I want to go somewhere exotic. So they send me to Bolivia. Breathless in Bolivia is about right. La Paz is the highest capital city in the world. It's up around 12,000 feet. The airport is called El Alto. It's up about 13,500 feet. And it is common for staff at the airport to be walking around with oxygen tanks because it's not uncommon for first-timers there to have the door opened and have them pass out for lack of oxygen. So I remember my first weekend there, I got in, and I felt a little better than I thought I would. I was 23 at the time. Go to check in at the embassy, and they said, take a lot of hard candy and sleep all weekend. I said, okay, the first part's really easy. The second part's tough because I'm a little excited to be here. As it turns out, at that kind of altitude, your body is producing an extra pint of blood because of the lack of oxygen, the lack of cells. You need the extra red blood cells to try to process as much oxygen as you can. So apparently the glucose or sucrose or one of the roses helps your body do that, hence the hard candy. And again, there's a map of South America. That's for you, those of you unfamiliar, that's where Bolivia is. And of course, there's a copy of my business card right there. Right there, tercer secretario, that means third secretary. The ranking system, if you will, in the diplomatic corps overseas is based on the level of secretary that you are. If you're third secretary, it means you're a junior officer. Second secretary, you're a little more senior. First secretary, you're very senior. And then you start getting into council generals, ambassadors, and whatnot, deputy chiefs, that type of thing. Now, this obviously was a cover. I love the fact that the title of my presentation is Department of State, but that was cover, and I was supposed to learn a lot of things about the Department of State so that I could tell you a lot about it. Frankly, I could tell you very little about it. I know it's on C Street in Washington, D.C., but my headquarters was across the river in Northern Virginia. So just a couple of things. This is one of their advertisements for Bolivia. We'll get into the demographics of Bolivia shortly. All this area here is the Andes, and this mountain right back here that you see is about 22,000 feet. All this area here where you see the toucan and whatnot, that's all the Amazon rainforest and river plain. So really it's almost the tale of two countries is Bolivia. This is La Paz right here. Once again, the highest elevation capital in the world. Just a neat place. I would call it very barren. I would call it desolate. The weather is cool all year round, given you're up so high. It doesn't snow there, but in the summertime it gets an awful lot of rain. As you can imagine, it gets chilly, but it averages about 70 every day, and then about 40 every night. It's almost like being in San Francisco. One of the differences is from San Francisco is if it's a sunny day and you're outside, you're going to want to wear an extra layer of clothing because, frankly, the sun's just going to go right through whatever you have on. And it's hard to read. Here's a copy of my orders from Department of State. You can go on again. And then here is a letter from the ambassador, and it's interesting in the world of diplomacy. The ambassador is the president of the United States for all intents and purposes. He is his or her rep, or she is his or her rep in that country. So, it's obviously always Mr. or Miss Ambassador. One thing I wanted to point out was right here, and I'll read it to you because it's almost impossible to read. Since the United States government has sent us here, we have an obligation to do our best to protect and project the values that have made our country great. And it was something that I would read from time to time on this letter so that I would never feel complacent or that I would never take for granted not who I was, but really where I was from and who I was representing. We'll get into a couple of stories later, but one thing that strikes me is, one thing about America is that we're the land of opportunity. And when you live overseas, and I assume many in this room have, I can think of no better example than appreciating the opportunities that we have here than living overseas. 80% of the world is third world, meaning they struggle most every day. When you think about where we're from and what's available to us, whether we want a Pop-Tart at 2 o'clock in the morning or we want to go play golf, 3 time zones away, these are things that we can do easily, or go to a library and actually find books. I mean, these are things that I learned very quickly to not take for granted. So it certainly was a source of pride to represent our country overseas. Whether I was defending our country or not is really up for interpretation. My job was to gather information on a timely basis and make sure our government knew about it. So it certainly was a form of defense for our country. So U.S. Embassy, La Paz. Fear of heights. We talked already about what the altitude is there at La Paz. Pretty interesting stuff. We're number 6. If you can believe it, at the time, our embassy in La Paz was the 6th largest in the world. I can tell you Mexico City was larger, Tokyo was larger, London was larger. I can't name the rest of Moscow, would have been larger certainly. But if you can believe it, a small country like Bolivia, which most people couldn't pick out on a map, was our 6th largest. Now, the reason was very simple. It was predominantly because of the narcotics trade down there. Bolivians averaged at the time about $900 per year in annual income. So, one of the jobs of the U.S. government down there in an official capacity was to say, stop growing your coca leaves and instead, start growing pineapples and citrus fruits and whatnot. And, being objective, it's hard not to side with the local Bolivians when they could get $300 to $500 a month on their coca leaves going for illicit purposes instead of $300 to $500 a year for their pineapples. And, of course, their government couldn't sustain, giving them extra money for those type of programs. Neither could ours. So the big reason why we were the 6th largest embassy in Bolivia was because of the narcotics trade. Not just CN, but CT and CI. Those are some sexy acronyms back from when I was in the business. CN is obviously counter-narcotics. We had a lot of work and a lot of money going into that program down there. Bolivia is what's called a source country. Not a lot of drugs or narcotics are manufactured there, but it produces a good deal of the world's coca. Obviously, coca leaves being the predominant and necessary ingredient into cocaine. Now, to grow coca leaves, for those of you not familiar, you need a certain balance of temperature, moisture, and the final key is altitude. Without the altitude, you're not going to have a sustaining coca crop. So coca is grown heavily in Thailand, in some highlands over there between Thailand and Laos. It's grown heavily in Peru, and it's grown heavily in Bolivia. Now, I'm sure it's grown in a few other places, around the world, but those are the big 3, the very big 3. So in Bolivia, one thing you'll find about the country is that there's not a lot of violence there. There's not a lot of narcotics trafficking going on there because they're simply trying to get their leaves to all of the laboratories in Peru and especially Colombia and Venezuela. So, as a place to live, it certainly had its peril, but it wasn't like living in one of those countries I just mentioned where you do have the active narcotics trafficking and traffickers processing their stuff. Then they're really getting a little paranoid as to, okay, who's doing what and where, and are they protecting essentially their money crop. But not just counter-narcotics, but counterterrorism and counterintelligence. That was my role down there. I worked very closely with the Bolivian National Police on counter-terrorist and counterintelligence programs. So the first thing to think of is, well, gee, what kind of terrorist activity is there in Bolivia? So there are a couple of things that are of concern to U.S. government down there. They were at the time in the 80s, 90s, and into this century. 1981, Bolivia saw 13 presidents in 1 year. And of course, you use the term presidents loosely, but one president served 2 weeks, and you can do the math. Given that makes 12 presidents for 50 weeks, I would imagine a couple other terms of presidency didn't last much longer. Why is that important to us? Well, they're a neighbor. We all go back and remember the Monroe Doctrine. It's obviously important to have as strong of neighbors as we can, and one of our concerns is obviously letting leftist governments in or seeing leftist governments come in place. So 1981 was really kind of a wake-up year for our government in saying, wow, here's a country that we need to start focusing on stability-wise. So then what happens? 1983, George Shultz is down there on an official visit. His motorcade gets bombed. He's fine. And I don't think a lot would remember it. I don't know what kind of press coverage got up here. I was 13 years old. But, when a Secretary of State's motorcade gets bombed, that's obviously a big deal. 1987 is big because world tin prices crash. Bolivia has been and still is the largest tin producer in the country. Well, tin just isn't used as much anymore, whether it's because of increased recycling or it's because of different metals that are being used for products that tin used to be a part of. So what happens? We have, basically what's your flavor of the month for a president, and world tin prices crash. So there's a big problem down there. And, it's our government's nature to help and assist. but always keeping in mind that, hey, we want to protect our citizens and our interests. And that's what basically created the position that I went to fill, and this was back in 93 when I got down there. Other things in 87, 89, there were a couple other terrorist attacks on Bolivian and U.S. government installations, and students, there was a big student uprising down there in 1989 brought on by, again, a subversive element in Bolivia. So that's what put me down there. This word here is pronounced Yama and not Llama. I'm sorry to dictate, but I hear Llama up here, and the two L's is a Y, I promise. So those are Yamas, but this is a road trip that I would take, and that's how rampant Yamas really are. And there is an alpaca right there. Maybe some of us have some alpaca sweaters. Not as important here as some other places I've lived where it's a lot cooler. That in the background there is Lake Titicaca. Here's rush hour in Bolivia. Yeah, so next time you run over a pothole, just remember how much worse it can be. And there is a bridge that they just figured they couldn't get across Lake Titicaca, so they just stopped it right there. But that is Lake Titicaca there. It's the highest elevation lake, I believe, in the world that doesn't freeze over, so pretty interesting stuff to be there. Being part of the diplomatic corps, we're allowed one complimentary shipment of food during our 2 years there. We have to buy the food, but they'll pay the gazillions of dollars to have it sent down. So I'm sorry to say my eating habits haven't changed much in 15 years, but you can see this was my big delivery was my macaroni and cheese. This city here is called Potosi. This mountain is called Cerro Rico, meaning rich mountain. And that one mountain there basically funded most, if not all, of the Spanish Armada back in the late 16th century. When I say here, London, Paris, and Potosi, back in the 1570s and 1580s, if you were to guess the top 3 cities in the world in terms of population, you'd have to guess those 3. Potosi, Bolivia, of all places, in the late 16th century was the 3rd largest city on the planet. And why is that? All because of this mountain right here. They would then pack up llamas, not llamas, but llamas, down to the coast in Peru, or in what is now Peru, and they would then ship their treasures over to Spain, and that helped fund the Spanish Armada and, of course, the Spanish Empire back in the 16th and 17th centuries. I say top of the world because Potosi is up at about 13,500 feet. It is tied with a couple other cities, I think one in Nepal and whatnot, as one of the, if not the highest city in the world. This is inside of the big smelting plant and the big treasury that they had there in Potosi. You can see right there talking about the Llama Armadas. Those are the ones that obviously brought all the riches down to the port cities. What a difference a zero can make. So our office had our own plane. It was a small little twin prop plane that we had that was ours and that we would use to travel around the country and around the region. So on my first trip, we had what we would do is we would contract pilots out who had flown for Air America back in the Vietnam War days. And they'd be in every 6 to 9 months, and then we'd recycle them out. And they were a little rough around the edges, and they certainly had their experiences in the Southeast Asian War, which obviously influenced who they were. So we had one pilot who was our most seasoned, and we flew into Potosi with a load of supplies. And we dropped them off there, and then we had to load on a lot more, and it was myself, it was my boss, it was a Bolivian National Police bigwig, and it's one of the highest airports in the world. And the way the airport is situated, you've obviously got a little bit of an angle so you can take off better. But at the end of the runway, there is a small hill, basically, that's right in the way. So I understand that English is the universal language when you're talking about aeronautics, you're talking about piloting and flying and all. But this particular pilot liked to think that he knew Spanish. So when he was going over some specifics of the airport with the tower before we go to take off, he thought they said that the airport was at 1,200 feet when it's at 12,000. So up here, when I say what a difference a zero can make, I'll never forget sitting in that plane and feeling it buckle and buckle and buckle and buckle and barely pull up and go up. And we're looking down at this hill that's about this far from the wheels of the plane. And we didn't realize till an hour later just how imperiled our lives were. Well, he programmed the plane differently. Obviously, being up that high, there's less oxygen, so he has to calculate things differently to take off. So I'm happy to be here with you right now. Just going on to a little bit about golf up there, given it's certainly now what I do. This poor soul is, in fact, me, and that is as big of a drop as it looks. So golfers can be diehards. I wasn't about to take that penalty stroke drop. So, Tiger for a Day, it happens to be the highest elevation grass golf course in the world, is in La Paz, Bolivia, up at about 11,000 feet. And for the golfers, or even for those who enjoy nature around us, the grass is predominantly kikuya, which is a Southern California grass, and the trees are predominantly eucalyptus. So in fact, you can see some right back there. So obviously you see the cactus because things can be arid several months out of the year. But interestingly, it really felt like home with the playing surface and with the trees, and certainly with the climate, because it's dry about 9 months a year. When I say Tiger for a Day, obviously at 11,000 feet, that ball's going to go a heck of a lot further than it will at sea level. So I was able to walk tall for my year and a half of playing there for sure. This young man right here is a gentleman named Martin, and I put here Martin Opportunities, and I may hit on the opportunity theme again, and I never liked to soapbox, but Martin was the caddy I used routinely whenever I went out to play golf. Great kid. He was 19 or 20 years old. I mean, I guess I wasn't terribly older than he was, but we got along very well, and given I used him week after week, we got to know each other. And a few months into our relationship, I said, how's school going? Oh, it's going great. And he says, I'm getting ready to graduate high school. I thought, well, that's terrific. Are you going to go to college? And he just kind of looked at me funny. And he said, no. And I said, well, why not? And he said, well, I can't afford it. And then I said, well, is there a loan or something available? And I spoke fluent Spanish at the time. He didn't understand what I was saying. I mean, there were no loans available for education. And he basically hit his head on the ceiling. I showed you before the indigenous Bolivian, and they make up a good 80 to 85% of the population down there. The Spanish have come in, or had come in, and it's the European descendants who are really the captains of industry and the captains of commerce down there, and they control about 1 to 2% of the wealth. So what happens is you get these delightful people, I'm sorry I don't have a better picture of them, like Martin, and he basically was peaking. He was 20 years old, and unless he wanted to get into the illicit trade, some of which we spoke of with the coca leaves, or potentially try to make his way up to this country, or maybe go to Brazil where there might be a little more opportunity, that was it for him. Now he had a great job. If they're averaging $900 a year and I'm paying them $15 a loop in caddying, we can do the math. That's pretty darn good money for him. But it just, it broke my heart. Every time I'd come to the States, I'd come back with something for him. Usually it was a pair of shoes, something that was going to be practical for him instead of giving him a piece of candy or something, or a bag of candy coming back. So, as I talked about before, and I may bring up again, about the opportunity that we have as Americans. And then looking back to the letter I got from the ambassador saying, it's with pride that we should try to project not necessarily our lifestyle, but at least our ways of doing things, given look how successful it's been for us. I often think back about Martin, I wonder what he's doing. I mean, he may still be a caddy, which frankly will give him a great income for the rest of his life, or in Bolivian standards. But to think that you've kind of maxed out at 20 and you're out of opportunities, or at least out of most opportunities, to me was very sad. That was a copy of a cable that went out, for what it's worth, in June of 1994. We had an 8.2 earthquake in La Paz, but it was epicenter 250 miles below the ground. It was, according to all the reports we read, CNN and everything, the first earthquake ever felt, or recorded, that was felt between continents. It hit off, what do you call the machines to monitor that sort of thing. It set off machines in Chicago, Toronto, Minneapolis. That earthquake did. So I thought back to the Mexico City earthquake and how buildings just kind of flattened like pancakes. That was back in '85, I think. And I would definitely not be here today if that sucker was closer to the surface. I lived in a high-rise apartment. I was on the 6th floor. I remember being out of the shower and kind of feeling things sway and thinking, I can go to the stairwell, but by that time it won't matter because it'll just pop right down on me. So anyway, just, for those of you interested in science, it was the first ever earthquake recorded that was felt on 2 continents. Mr. 1981, that was not me, unfortunately, is this gentleman right here. His name is Colonel Linares, and he was my cutout with the Bolivian National Police. I say Mr. 1981 because he was involved in kidnapping the president in 1981. There's a book about him and everything. And he is, most Bolivians are pretty short. That's why whenever I played basketball with the National Police units, I'd play center, literally at 5'9", and I'd have a good amount of stuff. So it was great, blocking shots. But he is just, a shorter guy, stocky, and just scared the hell out of everybody. There was not a more intimidating figure in all the country than this man right here. And one thing that about Bolivia and a lot of Latin American countries is you're going to have two defense arms down there. You have, in Bolivia's case, a national police, and then you have the military. And depending on who's in power will dictate as to which organization has more power. And obviously that will dictate who, as U.S. government officials, we're going to work with. We don't want to work with the national police if they're not calling the shots, because then we're not going to be able to call our shots. And vice versa, obviously if it's the army. So at this time, the Bolivian National Police were the authority. The military was there. They certainly had their feathers ruffled, but they just didn't have a lot of say in things. So Colonel Linares managed all of the anti-terrorist and the intelligence forces and units, if you will, in Bolivia. Well, most of that program was funded by U.S. government. So my job was to run that program. My job was to liaise with about 300 Bolivian National Police officers and enlisted throughout the country, working on the programs I described before, doing counterintelligence and counterterrorism. So here's a guy here who just literally strikes the fear of God in everyone. He was involved in a coup, basically in 1981, and kidnapped a president. There's a book written about him, and he's got a chip on his shoulder as big as my head. And I will never forget the day I was introduced to him as his new liaison. He looked at me like, is this what it's come to? I mean, don't you all care about me? What about, wouldn't you send somebody seasoned down here? Basically, who is this kid? And it was an uphill battle for 2 years. I don't know how easy it ever got. And there were the disparaging remarks. There was the ignoring, the whatnot. But it was, I learned a lot, if anything, about a little bit of age discrimination, a little bit about treating others with respect and whatnot. And, again, he had a lifetime of intimidating and of whatnot. So I can see where it may not be part of his culture. But that guy right there, I had sleepless nights over him figuring out how to appease him. And the only way I was going to appease him is if I aged by 20 years. Like that. We talked about my first weekend there already, and I was in reasonable good shape. Being at military school, you run a lot and whatnot, and for my 2 years in Bolivia, just going uphill 2 blocks, I was out of breath. I mean, it's just crazy, the lack of oxygen up there. First encounter, I took 7 months of Spanish language training before going overseas, and it's one thing to learn the textbook Spanish, this is how the sentences are broken down, and this is your past participle and everything else, but it's another thing to be at a table of 28 Bolivians, which is what I found myself in 2 days into my assignment, and I'll never forget listening and forming sentences in my mind and knowing what I was going to talk about, and by the time I tried to jump in, there are 3 topics down the road, and it was just... fast forward 9 months after I arrived down there, I was getting compliments on my Bolivian accent. So it was a process, certainly, but that first weekend was a real toughie. First nosebleed, again, if you're planning a trip to Bolivia or somewhere with altitude, be ready for spot nosebleeds. It's funny, the nose gives you about 2 seconds before you have time to lean over, try to grab a tissue because there it comes. First takeoff, we talked about that. I won't tell you about the day the door of our plane blew open while we were mid-flight. That's why we have seatbelts. First lady, we'll talk about that in a second. First flesh wound and Rudy, those are both to be combined. We spoke briefly before that seldom would I have to put my life on the line because that's what we had others doing for us. There was a moment where or an operation that we ran against a house where there were some terrorists. Again, the use of the word Bolivian terrorists certainly needs to be said, with a grain of salt. But we were around a house, and we thought we had the perimeters covered. And just like that, I have something sharp stuck into the back of my neck. And of course, in my mind, before I pass out and there's blood everywhere, I'm thinking it's some machete that's this wide and this long. As it turns out, it was a blunted Phillips head screwdriver. Thankfully, because it didn't go down very deep. But that had happened. So when I say first flesh wound, that was kind of a wake-up call. But I just want to acknowledge Rudy. He's sometimes you talk about what was meant to be. We had our guys storm the house. And they were not wearing their flak jackets for some crazy reason. They kick in the door, and there's a bad guy right there on the other side of the door, and his gun jammed. So our guys took care of him, even though it would have been big trouble for our guys, again, because he didn't have his jacket on. So Rudy, he was a captain of the National Police, universally loved, really good guy, had a family, and, he's behind a retaining wall. He's got his bulletproof vest on. A bullet comes in right here, under his arm, kills him on the spot. So whenever I talk about either that story or about the National Police, I just want to give a little respects to Rudy, as we call him. So, okay, so again, First Lady we'll talk about in a minute. First Lady basically means I dated a Miss Bolivia for a while. That's just something I have to throw out there. Well, there she is, Miss Bolivia. So she was very nice. Goni, was the president of Bolivia. I misplaced the picture I have with him, unfortunately. But just to give you an idea of some of the access that I got when I was down there in this capacity, to be at a big function with the president right down the way. That's him. That is, of course, Colonel Linares. Notice how he's turned away from me. That was standard for him. Anyway, Goni, interestingly and very briefly, he was born in Chicago, never even went to Bolivia till he was 18, got an education at University of Illinois, Chicago. They used to say that he had a gringo accent. I had folks tell me that my accent in Spanish was better than his, and he would always want to do his meetings in English. I would meet with him about once every 4 months or so, obviously in my diplomatic cover. But he would always want to do it in English, never in Spanish. So really good guy, though. He got to be president again a few years ago, and he was ousted in a coup. Just a couple things that happened down there. We had a brand new embassy built for us. We were in the top floors of a bank building when I first moved down there. Then we moved to a beautiful, really a compound with the security fences and with our own marine attachment and whatnot. For those of you who worked overseas, the big thing for the diplomatic community every year is the Marine Corps Ball. It's held every November, and it's obviously to celebrate the Marine Corps, and that's really a big deal. It's almost like prom for those of us working in the embassies. Obviously, my passion for golf came out very early. This is the Ambassador Bowers. This is when we all got into going to the embassy the first time. There was a big well-to-do about it. Hi, Mr. Ambassador. I had no idea he knew where I was, given, again, we're the 6th largest embassy in the world. Oh, hi, David. Hey, by the way, can you help me with this problem I'm having with my hooks and slices? So anyway, I should have known right then that this was going to be my calling, getting in the golf business. Then Vice President Gore came down in '94. I got to meet him. And for those of you who haven't met him or President Clinton, you'll see a picture of me and President Clinton later. They're really big guys. I mean, they've got broad shoulders. He's got hands twice the size of mine. And I don't know if that also helps to sell votes or something, because you're big, and I guess you're attractive if you look at that way. But I was really shocked by that. But burning oxygen, nosebleeds, and other vice presidential musings. I talked about El Alto Airport up at 13,000 feet and how staff there will walk around with oxygen tanks to take care of people. Nosebleeds was actually, Tipper there just absolutely lost her lunch. And that was because of the lack of oxygen. And we could not get them on their follow-up trip down to Argentina for about 3 hours because, again, any engineers in here may be familiar with it. We couldn't get one of the engines on Air Force 2 started. Again, it was lack of oxygen. Let the games begin. That gentleman right there was a spy. He was Russian. We knew it. And the best part is, he no doubt knew that we were. And if you ever saw The Russia House with Sean Connery, I think that's a good espionage type movie. There's one more, and I'm sorry I'm losing the name of it right now. But to me that was a little more realistic as to certain things that we go through. But one thing that I couldn't help from thinking is that it's cat and mouse a lot. Obviously the Russians are people that we may forever be interested in. We'd love to glean some information out of them. Gosh knows they'll always be more important than a country like Bolivia. But I always thought it interesting that when you meet these guys, we're briefed fully on who all their intelligence officers are. Gosh knows they are, and it's a game. And you pick at each other, see if there's a weakness, see if there's a motivation, see if they'll drop any tidbits that may be worth reporting back to Washington, and that's it. But it's, besides obviously the counterterrorism and intelligence stuff I did, there was obviously the other, more standard and traditional targets and countries of interest that the United States has. Now let the real games begin. This is just a picture of me coming up to Chicago for the World Cup in '94. Bolivia hadn't been there in about 40 years, so you can see we all dressed like fools and, tried to root them on to no avail. They lost to Spain 3-1, but it was a good time. Okay, so we talked about the National Police versus the Army. So we obviously aligned ourselves with the National Police. I think I won a bet here. That's why that's going on. The 12 admirals, we got a kick out of it. Bolivia has a navy. If you hearken back to the map of South America where Bolivia is, it doesn't have any coastline. So they've got 12 boats up on Lake Titicaca should the Peruvians ever invade. So 12 admirals. So you think we spend too much on defense spending. Imagine what they're doing. Okay, job description. These are some of my National Police compadres, if you want to call them that. They're really good guys. If some of them kind of have blank looks in their faces, that's because this is just another night of playing cacho, which is a dice game, and drinking until we can barely see straight. It's a Bolivian pastime. Again, Bolivians are dear people. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But, 3 nights a week, not that it was a regular schedule, but 3 nights a week, it was my job to go out with these guys and butter them up and go out and have a good time. So there we were. It was basically like a Yahtzee game with beer involved. Just a couple of side notes. This is me jumping into the Amazon. For those of you considering a trip down there, as I was told by my guide, straight face, the piranha will not bother you. They will only bother you unless you disturb them. Diving in may have, but no nothing. So that is the Amazon. And this is interesting. Eleanor Roosevelt made this statement once. She went down to visit Iguazu Falls, which is where this was taken. And it was rumored that she said, "Poor Niagara." And if you've never been down there, good heavens, it's on the tri-border with Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay. Just, I can't say, and it's the first time in my life, you can see I talk a lot. First time in my life I've been speechless. Just phenomenal. And they let you get right up to the base of it, as you can see. So this is misspelled. It typically is. They made me an officer in the National Police as I was on my way out of the country, probably knowing full well I would never be back in the country, so I can never go pull rank. But nice of them to do, so we can go on to the next one. That is the general who is in charge of all the national police in Bolivia, and a pretty big job when you consider it's almost like being a Secretary of the Army here in the United States. Obviously, it's on a smaller scale. So to show you the scope of the relationship we had, our embassy with the Bolivians and, of course, the National Police, and then the scope of the relationship I was able to develop. You see him pinning a medal on me, and he looks a little out of it, but that was my new boss. This is my team. This is part of the program. After getting the medal, you can go on one more time, and yeah. So there you go. Yeah, well, it was a day to celebrate, so they told me. What about Bolivia and the Bolivians, and then I'll get off the Bolivia trip, certainly. It really is a land of mystery. It's the least Americanized of all countries in the hemisphere, and I've been to a lot of them. It is one reason potentially why I left the Foreign Service. It was very isolated, very desolate. No McDonald's to be had, which sounds crazy, but consider being without it for a couple of years. And a land forgotten. Nobody really thinks of Bolivia. I mean, I certainly do all the time and look for it in the news, but otherwise it's one of those kind of forgotten third worldish countries. Welcoming people. I say that when under there I say half their size. Bolivia used to be more than twice its size. They have had land taken from them, annexed from them, whatever, by every neighbor. Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, Peru, Chile. And then the most poignant of those countries being Peru and Chile, it means that Bolivia has been rendered without a coastline. And they still consider themselves at war unofficially with Chile because Chile were the last ones to take land from them. But it has just had a horrific effect on them given they don't have that most valuable seaport. As welcoming people goes, it was at the time the second poorest country in Latin America after Haiti. And when you consider they make about $900 per year, it is remarkable how welcoming they are. The crime rate is ridiculously low. We talked about the lack of any narcotics traffickers activity there because it's a source country. But as people go, they were amazingly genuine. And I was always taken aback by how many invitations I got, being an American diplomatic official, to come with them to their homes. They wanted to cook for me. They wanted to show me around. And you visit these folks' homes, and, I've got friends or colleagues who are bummed out that they don't have an HD TV yet. And these, how these folks live, and at that altitude, meaning they probably don't have heat, they chances are they don't have running water, that they're able to not just live like that, but thrive as they can, and then be so welcoming to you into their homes is really very telling about the people in general. I don't hear that, for example, and not to sound disrespectful, I don't hear that, for example, about Colombians, where there's a lot more violence. I don't hear that about Peruvians, where there's a lot more violence. I don't hear that about Chile, where, frankly, there's a lot more affluence. Not to say that those people aren't great as well. I'm speaking from the heart, and certainly I know the Bolivians. Forever catching up, it's interesting, and I certainly believe in all the environmental movements going on. The U.S. is in a tough spot when we're saying, think green, everybody, go green, recycle, do this and that. I mean, they still have catalytic converters in their cars. They're dumping sewage into a river in their city where a mile downstream you have some locals scrubbing clothes and bathing their children. I mean, it's as much as I certainly believe in everything that we're trying to do for the environment, expecting or hoping that a lot of these countries will follow suit sometimes just doesn't get realistic. And so I'm not defending them, but I can't blame them at the same time. Hope. Natural resources and Evo. Natural resources, they're sitting on a slew of natural gas. One of the issue is having a stable government enough to bring in a foreign company who will want to put in the $500 million to be able to start sucking that natural gas out. They've got other natural resources there as well. The problem is R&D, obviously, is discovering those reserves and whatnot. And the problem there is the amount of, government is they've had 89 years or so now of history, and they've had about 193 presidents. Well, what does that do for the stability? And then Evo Morales is their current president, and we're not big fans of him because he's frankly a leftist. But he is of the people. He is a member of the indigenous class, if you will, so he speaks for about 80% of the people. And objectively, I'm pretty impressed by that. He is not of the old Spanish or European descent, who traditionally run the show down there. So, he's doing his best to, put some more power in the hands of the people and try to run some more social programs on their behalf. The tough part is, as I speak out of both sides of my mouth, he was also one of the subversives that we were monitoring back in the day because he would try to incite uprisings and all. It's a very interesting place, and it's just fraught with challenges. I'll just skirt over this. It talked about, amongst the most corrupt nations in the world, and, name the Latin American country, and it's in there, unfortunately. It's almost a fact of life. So onward with our tour, we're up to Barbados. So I have a feeling that the Uncle Sam felt sorry for me for sticking me in Bolivia for 2 years, so they send me here for my next assignment, which was Barbados. You'll notice up here it says Islands of Responsibility. I got poked fun at a lot from those I left in Bolivia. But that's exactly what I had. I had some islands that I had to work with their host services, and we did all counter-narcotics work here. The Caribbean base is a huge, and you've seen the movies, huge transshipment point for narcotics activity. So that's why we set up a big shop there in Barbados. In the Caribbean, this is Barbados right here. A lot of people don't realize it's about a 3.5-hour flight from Miami, so it's a good ways away from us. So Barbados, my islands were Dominica, right here, Antigua and Barbuda. Hiding up here is St. Martin. And then I also had the displeasure of going down to the Guyanas regularly as well. The Guyanas are just, wow, they're eye-opening. I would not recommend going there. Pardon me if there's any Guyanese in the room or if there's any Guyanese watching. Terrific people. My goodness, once again, welcoming with open arms, but just they're really not in good shape down there. So, again, great people, but that's kind of where it ends for the Guyanas. Go right ahead. It reminds me of a story. I talked about opportunity before, and it's interesting what kind of misperceptions might be out there about the United States and about what we're able to do or not do. When we talk about a land of opportunity, I had flown into Guyana, and it's about a 45-minute drive to downtown from the airport. And I could not get off the taxi driver from saying how money falls from the sky in New York City. He literally said, I want to go to New York City someday because I hear money falls from the sky there. And for my entire trip, I kept trying to say, well, no, we have opportunity for you. You can come in and get a job wherever you'd like, and then you can work your way up from there, and that's what makes America great. Oh, no, I hear money falls from the sky there. And I think it's a sign of two things. One, it's certainly a nice sign of hope for them, but it's also a sign of how bad things are for them in their own country if they are led to believe that very fact, which is, obviously absurd. So, but great people down there nonetheless. Center of the universe. I say this because, and I believe in national pride, and it needs to be pervasive, but it's amazing when I would go visit Dominica, which is an island that very few have heard of. It's not Dominican Republic, but it's Dominica, and very volcanic and very natural. Every time I got there, I got lectured by their chief of police. We worked on counter-narcotics things with him, on how the government is ignoring him on the banana issue, on narcotics trade, on getting the most favored nation status, and on about 8 or 9 different things. And I couldn't help from thinking to myself, and I don't mean to sound disrespectful, but it's, you're an island that's 18 by 23 miles. I mean, there's other things for U.S. government to kind of focus on. So as the diplomacy part of my job went in the Caribbean, it was really a juggling act. It was, yes, we understand how important you are. Obviously, your betterment is a betterment for all of us in the region and the hemisphere and for the United States. But, I just so much wanted to say, just relax. We're getting to it as much as we can. So the dragon, you can ignore that part of the picture. That was me dancing back in 1996. But there's a reason for the picture. This lady here was a Chinese national. The gentleman taking the photo was her husband. And he was an ambassador from the People's Republic of China, mainland China. They have been for quite some time, obviously of interest to the U.S. government, given their communist bent, and given their 1.4 billion people and their growing military. So I, in my role as an embassy official, befriended them. They had me into their home quite often, and we went out and did silly things like this. and I would see them about once every 3 weeks. They were stationed on Antigua, where they had an interest section, and I, once again, was obviously on Barbados, where we had our embassy. And I moved from Barbados and moved up to New York, and headquarters was insistent that I continue to work on them to see if I could eventually get them to provide some information for us. To show you how hard some of these countries are as targets of opportunity, if you will, my operation was one of 3 in the entire world that was worth any merit in the eyes of our headquarters. And it goes to show you that as much as, quite often I will get comments from friends or associates or people I meet that, well, gee, why are we spending so much money being in Bolivia, or why are we spending so much money being in the Caribbean or whatnot? That's part of the intelligence business. You don't know, A, who you're going to run across, or B, what kind of inroads you're going to make with that person. We've got a huge embassy in Beijing. We've got a huge embassy, well, actually, we've got a lot of various offices even in the United States, so that we can look at these foreign nationals that are in the country. Imagine San Francisco with all the Chinese up there. We've got embassies around the world, and we're obviously looking at representatives of this country very closely. So I'm in this very small island in what some could call a less significant part of the world, and I've got one of the 3 most important operations going with Chinese nationals. I ended up flying down to Antigua from New York to hit them up about being more cooperative with us, and it wasn't pleasant. So I had to do a lot of backpedaling and kind of do a little face saving, and needless to say, I never spoke with them again. But it was an operation that went about 1.5 years, and it was close to getting to fruition. This was back in 1996, and I got armed with, if you will, a device where I would have to go out in the wide open, and I would have to set it up, and I would have to keep track of where our satellite was. Not that I could, not that it's on a beacon, but I would know where it was at certain times of day. So I'd go out at night, and then I would have to point my receiver in that direction, and I would send a message, and it would real time hit a desk where they're basically following every one of my moves, so they could know what was going on. Obviously, standard email wasn't good enough, and I wasn't going to make a phone call. So it was interesting and a little nerve-wracking, going through airports with this contraption, because it was in a concealment device, and it got a little scary. But it was interesting that technology existed about 12 years ago, and I'm fascinated to know what they might have going now. I'm sure whatever contraptions they have are a lot smaller, because here I am trying to fumble this thing together and not get caught and point it in the right direction. But interesting stuff. But the operation eventually, obviously it failed. But it was interesting to go through the exchanges and hear a little bit about life in China, and it's nice to know that Uncle Sam thought I was doing an okay job on that one. After Barbados, it's already been intimated, I went up to New York City. And the organization I work for, we do work here in the country. We just look at foreign nationals because, FBI, NSA, that type of thing, they are not allowed to look at foreigners, if you will, but we were. So just to make sure, for any legality reasons, the organization I was with, we don't look at U.S. persons, if you will. We just look at foreigners. Okay. So I want to be a part of it. Always want to live in New York City, and just got to live my dream. Lived in Manhattan for a year before I skipped out of there and got into the golf business, but just loved it to death. I was their only enemy. I was tasked with monitoring what the Cubans were up to. The Cubans have a very, very large presence in New York City. They have an interest section there. And when I say their only enemy, you'll read routinely in the newspapers how Cubans have successes against us, whether it's through spying, whether it's through having U.S. diplomats down in Cuba leave, whatever the case may be, or just simply the Castro family being a thorn in our side. We're their only enemy. We're all they care about. Dating back to 1959 with the coup when Fidel took over, imagine the United States having one enemy out there. That's all. We don't have to worry about the other 212 countries. We've got one, and we can devote all of our resources to it. Well, that's the way the Cubans are. So even though they are certainly a country of more limited means than we are, they sent their very best and their brightest to New York City, and they did a darn good job. They would certainly do their best to influence, whether they're politicians or just champions of industry. And it was my job to see what they were up to, both electronically and through human sources, and just see if we couldn't form a little more policy in Washington because of it. Interesting, we had an office in Midtown, and then midway through the year, we moved to World Trade Center. So my office there was on the 25th floor of World Trade Center 7, which I think went down that afternoon of 9/11. So, I know we've all in this room been in New York City, but I don't know if y'all have been in those buildings or worked in those buildings, but it's pretty sobering to return there and just see, a big void. So, some other things that I got involved in New York City, we had a big subway scare this was in 1997. Where there were some bomb threats, again, by some, I don't know what the elements were, but, some terrorists, if you will. So I remember being involved there. I think I was up almost 2 days straight because we were monitoring a lot of things with the FBI on a big subway scare there. Russian targets, we talked about the game playing, and it certainly didn't end in New York City. Why would we have such a big diplomatic presence and then such a big espionage presence in New York City? It's because everybody else does. It's because besides being in Washington, D.C., all the other countries are going to send their best and their brightest to New York because of the presence of the United Nations. So those of us working there would go under a guise of working with the United Nations, and it would help us get in front of some targets, some intelligence people, and some other people of influence who we wanted to try to start to influence ourselves, not the least of which were Russians. And I met with a gentleman a couple times, and it was just so blatant that we both knew who each other were. We just kind of, kidded each other about it, and I'll never forget my last lunch. It was, he basically asked me if I wanted to start working for them, and I basically asked them if they want to start working for us, and, it just wasn't, kind of went downhill from there. So Madrid versus Tampa. I turned down an assignment in Madrid to get in the golf business. And as I like to tell the story, I was, again, living in Manhattan because Uncle Sam was footing the bill. And, in my off time, went to see a lot of plays and a lot of theater and concerts and sporting events and you name it. And, of course, you can walk or take the subway to everything. And gave all that up and moved down to Tampa and made $5.15 an hour and was scrubbing clubs and cleaning golf carts and got in at the ground floor. So, you go right ahead. Since then, I think a lot of you are familiar with my background. So we'll jump through most of the rest of this. But, as I've told a lot of those who are maybe closer to me, you're really looking at one of the lucky ones. I had always wanted to live in the Caribbean. I did it. I had always wanted to work in well, not always, but I had considered working for Uncle Sam in more of a clandestine capacity. I did it. I always wanted to live in New York City. Boom. I got to do that for a year. And then my dream developed into wanting to be a golf professional and work in the golf business. And here I am.
Thank you for joining Peninsula Seniors Lecture Series. I'm Betty Wheaton. I'll see you next time.